Before we begin tonight's journey through history, I want to thank you for being here. If you enjoyed these long, quiet explorations of the past stories that help you drift into rest, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's free, and it helps us continue creating these gentle documentaries night after night. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now, let us settle in. The atmosphere of late medieval Europe was heavy with unease. Fields stretched in long lines across the land, worked by men and women who rarely traveled more than a few miles from the village of their birth. For many, life was simple, dictated by the seasons, by the turn of the plow, and by the Sunday sermon. Yet, beneath this surface of apparent monotony, a slow current of fear and suspicion was building an undercurrent that, in time, would break into accusations of witchcraft and ignite centuries of persecution. The idea of witches was not born suddenly in the late Middle Ages. Long before villagers whispered about neighbors casting spells on their cows, European traditions carried fragments of older beliefs, remnants of pagan rituals, folk remedies, and superstitions. In rural communities, there was often someone known for knowledge of herbs, charms, or weather signs. These figures, sometimes admired, sometimes mistrusted, were not yet universally called witches. They might be labeled as wise women, cunning folk, or simply healers. Their role was practical, filling the gaps left by limited medical knowledge and scarce resources. But as Christianity expanded across Europe, older beliefs were not easily erased. Instead, they lingered, blending uneasily with a new faith. Priests often tolerated minor folk practices, especially when they did not seem to contradict church teaching directly. A charm whispered over a wound or a small offering to ward off storms might have seemed harmless, yet in times of crisis, when famine struck, when livestock sickened, when plagues swept through villages, such practices could easily shift from tolerated custom to suspected heresy. The first sparks of witchcraft accusations were tied less to dramatic images of broomsticks and cauldrons than to everyday grievances. A neighbor's child fell ill after a quarrel. A cow gave sour milk after someone muttered angrily by the fence. A sudden storm destroyed a harvest, and villagers remembered the woman who had always been seen alone, muttering as she gathered herbs at twilight. In such moments, suspicion gave shape to an invisible enemy, and the figure of the witch began to take form. Church records from as early as the 10th and 11th centuries mention condemnations of sorcery and charms, though these were not yet full-blown witch trials. The Synod of Paderborn in 785, for example, had explicitly declared that belief in witches who could fly or change the weather was false, a delusion planted by the devil. For centuries afterward, church authorities were cautious in treating witchcraft accusations, often regarding them as superstition. And yet, despite official warnings, the idea of hidden magical forces persisted in daily life. By the 13th century, a new shift occurred. Europe was experiencing upheavals, the spread of new diseases, the instability of feudal structures, and the tensions of expanding trade and contact with distant lands. The Black Death in the 14th century would later intensify this anxiety. But even before the plague, communities were fragile. In such an environment, fears of unseen forces became fertile ground for accusations. Witchcraft slowly moved from being dismissed as foolish superstition to being seen as a genuine threat to Christian society. At the same time, the church began to define heresy more strictly. The medieval Inquisition, established to root out heretical movements, created a framework in which accusations of unorthodox practices could be investigated and punished. While the Inquisition did not initially focus on witches, it helped lay the groundwork for what was to come. Heretics were seen as enemies of the faith, dangerous not only for their own souls, but for the community around them. This logic would eventually be applied to those accused of witchcraft. They were not simply misguided villagers, but dangerous collaborators with the devil. Ordinary life provided endless opportunities for suspicion to take root. Consider the rhythm of a medieval village. Families living in cramped cottages, fields tilled communally, bread ovens shared by neighbors. Privacy was rare. Intentions often simmered close to the surface. If a neighbor's chickens wandered into another's garden, a small debt went unpaid. If a glance was interpreted as hostile, it could easily turn into gossip. Gossip, once spoken, spread quickly through narrow streets and churchyards. A woman seen muttering over herbs might be accused of brewing harmful potions. A man skilled at predicting storms might be seen as commanding unnatural powers. One of the earliest recorded witch trials in Europe took place in the city of Toulouse in 1275, where a woman named Sybil was accused of using magic to harm others. The records are sparse, but they reflect the emerging pattern, a combination of local grievances, suspicion, and the involvement of ecclesiastical courts. Sybil's case was not isolated. Throughout the late 13th and 14th centuries, small clusters of accusations appeared in cities and villages across France, Germany, and Italy. What is striking about these early accusations is their ordinariness. They were not grand tales of Sabbaths with the devil or flights through the night sky. They were rooted in the everyday. Spoiled butter, dead livestock, unexplained illness. The grand demonological image of witches would come later, shaped by theologians and authors. But in the villages, witchcraft was personal. It was about neighbors, about grudges, about the fragile balance of survival in a world where misfortune was constant. As the 14th century wore on, the Black Death devastated Europe, killing an estimated third to half of the population. In the wake of such catastrophe, suspicion deepened. If whole villages could be wiped out by disease, surely unseen enemies were at work. Some blamed Jews, others blamed heretics, and still others turned to the idea of witches. This atmosphere of fear created fertile soil for the witch trials. Cat would follow in the 15th and 16th centuries. The early sparks of witchcraft accusations show how fragile daily life could be and how easily fear could reshape it. For a peasant struggling to feed a family or a widow living alone, a single rumor could mean the difference between being tolerated and being cast out. Survival was not only about enduring the cold or finding enough bread, tax. It was about navigating the hidden currents of suspicion, where a wrong word or a neighbor's grievance might spark something much larger. And so, as Europe moved into the late Middle Ages, the figure of the witch was slowly carved from ordinary suspicion, sharpened by fear, and fueled by the church's growing concern with heresy. These first sparks were not yet the firestorms of later centuries, but they revealed how vulnerable a community could be when fear and belief intertwined. But if these were only the beginnings, what would happen when fear found authority? When whispers in village lanes became formal charges in courts, and when a manual appeared to systematize the very hunt for witches? Asterisk, by the late Middle Ages, whispers of witchcraft had begun to settle into something heavier, more organized. What had once been scattered fears, gossip at wells, mutterings in markets, a priest's occasional sermon against superstition, now started to coalesce into something with sharper edges. Suspicion was no longer merely a neighbor's quarrel. It was beginning to attract the attention of bishops, inquisitors, sprying, and secular authorities who saw in these rumors the seeds of something that might undermine not only Christian faith, but also political order. The village-level accusations of the 13th and early 14th centuries had remained largely local in scope. They might lead to a trial before a town council or a questioning by an ecclesiastical court, but they did not yet involve systematic hunts. However, this period saw the gradual weaving together of theological thought, canon law, and local grievance, which would transform witchcraft from petty, superstition into a crime perceived as threatening the entire Christian world. At the heart of this transformation was a subtle shift in how magic was understood. Early medieval teachings had distinguished between natural magic and demonic magic. Natural magic was tied to knowledge of herbs, minerals, and astrology. It was not automatically condemned. A physician using charms alongside herbal remedies might be tolerated if his practices seemed to align with natural philosophy. But demonic magic invoking spirits or demons was seen as heresy. By the 14th century, the boundaries between these categories blurred. A charm whispered by a healer might once have been seen as harmless. Now it could be reinterpreted as a pact with evil. This was not only a matter of theology, but of politics. Europe in the 14th century was riddled with crises. The 100 Years' War erupted between England and France. The Black Death ravaged towns and fields. Peasant uprisings shook feudal systems, and the papacy itself was divided in the Great Schism with rival popes in Rome and Avignon. In time, the Inquisition, which had first been created to combat groups like the Cathars, began to extend its scope. By the mid-14th century, inquisitors were recording cases not only of heretical preachers, but also of individuals accused of sorcery. The logic was the same. Both were seen as undermining the unity of Christendom. A heretic questioned church teaching, which, supposedly, threatened it through invisible alliances with demons. And once inquisitorial machinery was applied to witchcraft, the stakes grew higher. Records from Switzerland in the late 14th century reveal how this shift unfolded. In the region of Valais, scattered accusations against sorcerers and witches coalesced into one of the earliest large-scale witch hunts. Beginning in the 1420s, dozens of individuals were tried, often under torture, for crimes such as causing hailstorms, poisoning wells, or flying to nocturnal gatherings. The Valley trials foreshadowed the patterns that would later dominate European witch hunts. Confessions extracted under duress, accusations spreading from one villager to another, and local fears given official recognition by courts. Behind these confessions was a growing belief in diabolical conspiracy. Earlier fears had focused on individuals, someone spoiling butter, harming cattle, or cursing a neighbor. Accusations expanded into claims that witches gathered in secret groups, worshipped the devil, and plotted the destruction of Christian society. This concept of a witch's Sabbath was not an ancient folk belief, but a construction shaped by inquisitors and theologians. Yet, once it was written into trial records, it became part of the cultural imagination. The village healer was no longer simply a suspicious figure. She could be seen as part of a vast and sinister conspiracy. Daily life played a critical role in how these fears spread. Imagine a small alpine village where harvests were short, winters long, and the survival of livestock crucial. If a cow died unexpectedly or a hailstorm flattened crops, the need for explanation was urgent. Natural causes disease, weather, chance offered little comfort. But if someone could be blamed, then the misfortune at least had meaning. The neighbor, long suspected of muttering spells, might suddenly be accused of summoning the storm. Communities shared suspicion, reinforced by an inquisitor's questions, could turn rumor into testimony. The role of torture in shaping witchcraft narratives cannot be overstated. Inquisitors often entered a village with a framework of what they expected to find: pacts with the devil, secret gatherings, flight through the air. When suspects were tortured, their confessions tended to follow the patterns already suggested by their interrogators. One village's testimony would implicate another, and soon entire networks of supposed witches appeared on parchment records. Thus, the idea of a satanic conspiracy spread not only through rumor, but through the legal processes themselves. While the church played a role in developing these ideas, secular authorities were also deeply involved. Local lords often supported witch trials as a way to assert control over their subjects. In some cases, the confiscation of property from accused witches provided material incentives. Trials became not only spiritual contests, but also political and economic tools. The gendered aspect of witchcraft accusations also sharpened during this period. While men were accused, the majority of those brought to trial were women, often widows, midwives, or those who lived on the margins of society. These women occupied vulnerable positions without a husband's protection, relying on neighbors' goodwill, and often associated with tasks like healing or childbirth that were already tinged with mystery. In times of crisis, they became easy scapegoats by the early 15th century. The outlines of what would later be known as the witch craze were already visible. Local grievances had merged with ecclesiastical fears, and trials had begun to systematize accusations, though still relatively rare compared to what was to come. These early sparks show how deeply intertwined fear, faith, and survival were in shaping the idea of the witch. The intellectual world of the period also played a role. Scholars at universities debated the nature of demons, the possibility of magic, and the reality of pacts with the devil. Texts circulated among clergy and educated elites, gradually filtering down into sermons and confessional manuals. In this way, elite theology and village gossip reinforced one another. What a peasant might fear in a field at dusk could be confirmed by a preacher citing learned authorities. Even as these fears spread, skepticism persisted. Some clerics and judges dismissed accusations as folly, urging restraint. In certain regions, authorities were reluctant to prosecute witches, considering such cases beneath serious attention. But the tide was turning, and by the mid-15th century, the balance leaned increasingly toward belief. The early history of witchcraft accusations, then, is not a story of sudden eruptions, but of gradual layering. Folk traditions, theological developments, inquisitorial practices, political instability, and local rivalries. Each element added weight to the figure of the witch until she became not only a village scapegoat, but a perceived enemy of Christendom itself. Yet, these sparks, as dangerous as they were, remained localized. A great firestorm of witch trials was still to come. That fire would be lit not only by fear and rumor, but by the deliberate codification of witch hunting in manuals, most notoriously the Malleus Maleficarum. And so the question lingers: what happens when scattered fears are given a book, a doctrine, and a process? Asterisk, as Europe stepped into the middle of the 15th century, the scattered flames of suspicion had begun to glow brighter, spreading from village gossip to legal parchment, from whispered rumors to the pulpits of churches. What had once been the uneasy mutterings of neighbors now carried weight, echoed by inquisitors and secular courts alike. The figure of the witch was moving beyond mere superstition and toward the construction of an entire system of belief, one that would define Europe's witch trials for centuries. It is here, in this transition, that we began to see how the local and the global, the mundane and the theological, intertwined. A cow falling ill in a village was no longer just bad luck. A quarrel between women in the marketplace was no longer simply neighborly rivalry. Each could be recast through the growing lens of witchcraft, where personal misfortunes were signs of diabolical plots and small disputes echoed larger fears about society, order, and the soul. The invention of the printing press around 1450 played a quiet but decisive role in this transition. Before movable type, knowledge circulated slowly, copied by hand, or carried orally from one region to another. With printing, treatises, sermons, and trial records could spread across Europe at an unprecedented pace. Accusations that once stayed local could now become part of a wider narrative. A printed pamphlet describing a witch trial in one German town might reach the next, planting seeds of suspicion even before local crises took shape. In this way, the witch became not only a neighbor, but a figure of Europe's imagination. Theologians contributed heavily to this reimagining. The most influential work of the late 15th century was the Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican inquisitor. The Malleus, meaning hammer of witches, did not appear out of nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of theological debate, trial practices, and fears crystallized into one manual. Its pages offered not just arguments, but instructions: how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, and why their crimes were so dangerous. It insisted that witches were real, that they conspired with the devil, and that they must be hunted without mercy. What made the Malleus so dangerous was not simply its content, but its timing. Released in an era of upheaval, the fall of Constantinople, the rise of exploration across the seas, and continuing wars in Europe, Kate gave people a way to interpret instability. If crops failed, if armies faltered, if sickness spread, there was now a textbook that explained why witches had become not only local scapegoats, but enemies of civilization itself. The language of the Malleus was chilling in its detail. It argued that witches could command storms, cause impotence, destroy harvests, and harm unborn children. It emphasized that women, by nature, were more susceptible to the devil's temptations, an idea that shaped centuries of accusations against widows, midwives, and women on the margins of society. And it outlined how trials should proceed, often urging the use of torture to extract. We also see, in this period, the emergence of patterns that would later dominate full-blown witch hunts. Accusations often began with small things: spoiled milk, butter that would not churn, bread that would not rise. But once voiced, they could spiral quickly. A single woman accused of souring a neighbor's milk might, under questioning, be forced to confess to gatherings at night, to meeting with the devil, to implicating others. Soon, an entire cluster of villagers might be drawn into the net, each name leading to another, each confession broadening the circle of suspicion. Economics played a hidden but important role in these developments. In many places, the property of convicted witches could be confiscated. This meant that accusations were not always purely about fear. They could also serve as tools of greed. A landowner who gained the fields of an accused woman, or a village leader who seized her cottage, had material reasons for supporting trials. In some regions, witchcraft accusations became entangled with disputes over inheritance, land rights, access to communal resources. Yet, it is important to remember that skepticism did not vanish. Many judges, bishops, and even some inquisitors resisted the growing fervor. Records survive of cases dismissed for lack of evidence, or clerics writing that belief in witches was foolishness. But skepticism was often drowned out by louder voices, especially when fear was high. Thus, the very existence of manuals like the Malleus ensured that, even if not every authority believed in witches, enough did to sustain centuries of trials. By the end of the 15th century, the landscape of Europe had been reshaped. Witchcraft was no longer merely a suspicion whispered among villagers. It had become a legal category, a theological threat, a political tool, and a cultural obsession. The first sparks that began in local grievances had now fed into something larger, a network of fears supported by books, courts, and the press. And yet, even in this period of expansion, much remained unsettled. Belief in witches was not uniform across Europe. In Italy, skepticism often prevailed, with trials fewer and more restrained. In Spain, the Inquisition was surprisingly cautious about prosecuting witches, preferring to focus on heresy among Jews and Muslims. In contrast, regions like Germany and Switzerland saw intense outbreaks of accusations, sometimes consuming entire towns. The witch trials, from the very beginning, reflected not one Europe, but many Europes, each with its own balance of fear, its faith, and survival. Looking back, it is striking how these developments were shaped not only by terror, but by the ordinary details of life. A failed harvest, a quarrel over bread, a child's feverol could serve as the spark for something much larger. The witch trials were not born of abstract theology alone. They were rooted in the soil of daily life, in the fragile realities of survival when misfortune demanded explanation. As the century turned, the path was set. The 16th and 17th centuries would see witch trials reach their height, burning across Europe and crossing into the New World. Thousands would be accused, tortured, and executed. Communities would be torn apart, and fear would become a daily companion. But in these early sparks, we see the beginnings, the way fear finds shape, the way authority gives it structure, and the way ordinary lives become the foundation for extraordinary persecution. And so the question remains, lingering at the end of this first story, if whispers in villages and manuals in monasteries could build such a fire, what does it reveal about the nature of human fear itself? Why does every age seem to find its own witches? Asterisk in the shifting landscape of late 15th century Europe, fear was already a constant companion. The continent had endured plague, famine, and endless wars. Faith was both a refuge and a source of anxiety, for the church itself was fractured by schism and plagued by criticism. It was in this climate of unease that one book emerged, a book that would take scattered suspicions of witchcraft and transform them into a systematic weapon of prosecution. Its title, in Latin, was Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. The Malleus was published in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, Dominican friar and inquisitor, though it bore the authority of co-authorship with Jacob Sprenger, another Dominican, whose name lent legitimacy to the work, even if his role in writing it was limited. The book was more than a treatise. It was a manual for action, where earlier writings on witchcraft had been fragmented, scattered among sermons, theological debates, canned local trial records. The Malleus brought everything together in a single, comprehensive volume. Its purpose was clear: to prove the reality of witches, to define their nature, and to instruct courts on how to identify, interrogate, and punish them. But the book was not neutral. It carried the heavy weight of Kramer's own obsessions and frustrations. He had faced resistance in his attempts to prosecute witches, with some church authorities dismissing his zeal as excessive. The Malleus was, in part, his rebuttal. It was written with the urgency of a man determined to prove that witches were not only real, but among the greatest. Threats to Christendom. The Malleus was divided into 3 parts. The first argued that witchcraft was real, and that to doubt its existence was itself heretical. This was crucial, for skepticism persisted even in the 15th century. Many clerics considered witches a fantasy, a relic of pagan superstition, unworthy of serious concern. Kramer countered this directly, weaving together scripture, church fathers, and scholastic reasoning to declare that witches did exist, and that their powers came from explicit pacts with the devil. The second part described the supposed powers of witches in elaborate detail. Here, Kramer laid out accusations that would echo through trials for centuries. Witches could cause storms, destroy crops, kill infants, and steal men's virility. They could fly through the night, consort with demons, and gather in secret assemblies to worship Satan. The vividness of these descriptions was not accidental. Kramer wanted to shock his readers, to leave them with no doubt that witches were active agents of destruction in their midst. The third part of the Malleus was the most practical. It instructed judges and inquisitors on how to conduct trials. It encouraged the use of leading questions, the extraction of confessions, and the acceptance of spectral evidence claims that witches could harm others through invisible means. It argued for the necessity of torture, for without it, witches would rarely confess, and it urged that punishment be severe. For the crime of witchcraft was not only against individuals, but against God himself. It is easy to imagine the effect of such a book in a world already primed by fear. Judges uncertain about how to handle accusations now had a guide. Priests preaching to their congregations now had a reference to cite. Local leaders suspicious of unrest in their villages now had a framework to explain and control it. The Malleus did not invent witchcraft trials, but it gave them coherence, legitimacy, and momentum. The role of the printing press cannot be overstated. Before the 1450s, a book like the Malleus would have circulated slowly, copied by hand in a monastery or shared among a small circle of clerics. But with movable type, it could be printed in hundreds of copies and spread across Europe within a generation. By the early 16th century, the Malleus had been reprinted multiple times, appearing in cities from Cologne to Venice. Each new edition extended its reach, embedding its arguments into the fabric of European thought. Yet, the book was not merely theological. It reflected and reinforced cultural anxieties of its time, especially about gender. Kramer devoted significant space to arguing that women were particularly prone to witchcraft. He described them as weak in faith, carnal in desire, and easily swayed by the devil. He cited biblical passages such as Eve's role in the fall as proof of women's susceptibility. While not the first to suggest such ideas, the Malleus gave them a forceful, systematic expression that shaped the gendered nature of witch trials for centuries. Behind these sweeping arguments lay practical consequences. A widow who lived alone, a midwife who oversaw births, or a woman who sold herbs in the market. Any of these figures could now be seen not simply as suspicious, but as inherently vulnerable to demonic corruption. Once accused, the framework of the Malleus ensured that their chances of defense were slim. For how could one argue against a system that declared doubt itself to be heresy? To understand the influence of the Malleus, one must picture the fragile texture of daily life. Imagine a small German town in the late 15th century. The fields had suffered a poor harvest, and bread was scarce. In such a setting, resentment brewed easily. A child fell ill, a cow miscarried, or a storm struck at the wrong time. Villagers, already anxious, turned their eyes toward the familiar figure at the edge of society, the woman who spoke to herself as she gathered herbs, the man who muttered prayers not heard in church. Once suspicion arose, the Malleus offered authority. What might once have been dismissed as idle rumor now carried the weight of doctrine. There were critics of Kramer's work, even in his own time. Some church officials considered him overzealous, and the University of Cologne initially condemned aspects of the book. But such criticisms were drowned out by its wide circulation, and by the broader appetite for certainty in uncertain times. The Malleus provided an answer to a troubling question. Why did bad things happen? Its answer, because witches, in league with the devil, sought to destroy the faithful, was terrifying, but it was also simple. And simplicity has always had a powerful hold on human imagination. In the centuries that followed, Adamius would become one of the most infamous books in history. It did not act alone. Many other texts, sermons, and local customs shaped the course of witch trials, but it became a symbol of the period's obsession with persecution. Its pages gave justification to fear, turned rumor into evidence, and sanctioned cruelty in the name of faith. And so, from the presses of late medieval Europe, the hammer of witches fell, not in the abstract, but on the fragile lives of ordinary people. What began as a book became a tool of destruction, binding together theology, law, and fear into one relentless force. But what happens when words on a page meet the raw realities of courtrooms? When theory is put into practice, and when the lives of neighbors are torn apart by accusation. Asterisk, when the Malleus Maleficarum left the presses of Cologne in 1486, it entered a Europe restless with unease. But a book, no matter how forceful in tone, is only as powerful as its application. What, truly, marked the Malleus as transformative was how it migrated from text to trial, from parchment to courtroom. Its arguments seeped into legal processes, shaping how interrogations were conducted, how evidence was weighed, and ultimately, how lives were destroyed. The late 15th and early 16th centuries saw the first real testing ground of the Malleus. In regions of Germany, Switzerland, and parts of France, local courts began to adopt its methods. In these places, suspicion of witchcraft was already high. The manual simply provided a framework that turned whispers into procedures. Judges, who once hesitated to prosecute, found reassurance in its pages. Clergy, uncertain about how far to pursue accusations, could now point to the Malleus as justification. One of the book's most consequential teachings was its insistence that disbelief in witches was itself heresy. This silenced critics in many courtrooms. A villager might protest that his neighbor could not possibly be guilty, that she had always been a kind widow or a skilled healer. But if such defense implied doubt about witchcraft itself, it carried the risk of being labeled heretical. Silence, therefore, became safer than objection. In this way, the Malleus did not only target the accused, it reshaped entire communities by constraining how people could even speak about suspicion. Another hallmark of the Malleus was its justification of torture. European courts already used torture in certain cases, but the manual elevated its necessity for witch trials. It argued that witches, under the devil's protection, would resist ordinary questioning and only reveal the truth under pain. This rationale led to confessions that bore the stamp of the interrogator's expectations. When a woman screamed, under torture, that she had indeed flown to a Sabbath, met with demons, or cursed her neighbor's cow, the confession reinforced the framework laid out in the Malleus. Each trial, then, became not only punishment, but evidence for the book itself, a circular confirmation of its claims. The ripple effect was profound. In the city of Innsbruck, where Kramer himself had attempted earlier prosecutions, his reliance on the Malleus allowed him to press further than he had before. In Switzerland, the Valais trials absorbed elements of the manual, fueling accusations that spread like wildfire through villages. In Germany, the text became a touchstone for local authorities, grappling with unexplained misfortunes. Wherever it was cited, the process became harsher, and outcomes more deadly. But beyond procedure, the Malleus also shaped imagination. Its descriptions of witches power-skilling infants, destroying crops, seducing men, and commanding storms were repeated in sermons and pamphlets. Villagers who once feared their neighbor's evil eye now spoke of her as a servant of Satan. Women who sold herbs or delivered babies were no longer just suspicious, they were potential agents of the apocalypse. The manual had turned the witch from a local mischief maker into an existential threat. One can picture how this transformation is unfolded in a rural community. A farmer's wife falls ill suddenly, and whispers spread that the old woman at the edge of the village cursed her. In earlier times, The matter might have been settled with gossip, perhaps an angry scolding, or, at worst, a small fine imposed by the village court. But now, with the malleus in circulation, local authorities might treat the accusation differently. A judge, citing the manual, could summon the accused, question her under oath, and, if unsatisfied, order torture. Once under duress, the woman might confess not only to cursing the wife, but also to attending Sabbaths, flying through the night, or conspiring with others. Those others would then be named, and the net of suspicion widened. What had begun as one accusation could consume a dozen. The printing press amplified this effect as editions multiplied. Reports of trials fueled further fear. Pamphlets spread lurid tales of witches exposed, their confessions printed for the public to read. Up a villager hundreds of miles away might learn of a trial in Cologne or Basel and begin to suspect similar figures in his own village. In this way, fear became contagious, passed not only from mouth to ear, but from press to reader. The economic incentives interlaced with these processes cannot be ignored. The malleus gave courts justification to seize the property of the accused. For some, towns and lords, witch trials became opportunities for financial gain. Confiscated land or goods were redistributed, sometimes to those very individuals who had supported the accusations. The manual thus functioned not only as a theological text, but also as a tool of political and economic control. Gender remained central to its influence. Kramer's insistence on women's greater vulnerability to witchcraft resonated deeply with patriarchal structures of the time. In practice, it meant that women, especially widows, midwives, and healers, bore the brunt of accusations. Male witches were not unheard of, but the overwhelming majority of victims were female. In village after village, suspicion fell hardest on those least protected by kinship or wealth. Still, the spread of the malleus was not uniform. Some regions resisted. In Italy, skeptical judges limited its influence, preferring more restrained approaches. In Spain, where the Inquisition was powerful, the manual was received cautiously, as Spanish authorities maintained their own frameworks of heresy and were wary of Kramer's extremism. Yet in Central Europe and Germany, Switzerland, and France, the text became a touchstone, a reference, cited again and again in trials that left thousands dead. It is striking how a book written by one man, fueled by his frustrations and zeal, could take on such vast authority, but its power lay in timing. Europe, still recovering from plague and famine, fractured by war and schism, was searching for explanations. The malleus gave one. The enemy was not distant, not hidden in foreign armies or distant cities, but within the very fabric of the community. The neighbor, the healer, the solitary widow, they were the danger. And once such an idea takes hold, it is difficult to uproot. Each trial reinforced the next. Each confession, no matter how tortured, strengthened the system. The malleus had moved from parchment to practice, and in doing so, it had transformed witchcraft from rumor into one of the darkest institutions of early modern Europe. Yet even as its influence spread, cracks remained. Some theologians continued to question its reasoning. Some courts dismissed cases as frivolous. In certain regions, skepticism would eventually reassert itself. But for now, the hammer was falling, and Europe was beginning to feel its weight. And so we are left with a question that lingers in the dim light of history. What happens when fear is not only felt, but codified, when it is given not only voice, but law? By the early 16th century, the Malleus Maleficarum had become more than a book. It was a symbol, a framework, and in many ways, a justification for fear. Its words left the printed page and seeped into sermons, confessional manuals, and the daily vocabulary of suspicion. Judges cited it, preachers warned from it, and common villagers, though unlikely to have read it, lived with the effects of its arguments as trials multiplied. The Malleus had not invented witch hunts, but it had accelerated them, embedding them in Europe's cultural and legal consciousness. The long-term impact of the Malleus rested on three interwoven forces: repetition, legitimacy, and imagination. Repetition came through the printing press, which ensured that the book's claims could be copied, reprinted. Legitimacy was provided by the church, or more precisely, by the aura of church authority that the Malleus claimed. Although the University of Cologne had initially censored it, Kramer attached papal bulls and ecclesiastical approvals to the text, giving it a sheen of orthodoxy. 4 local judges, unsure of how to act in witchcraft cases, this gave the manual credibility. If the church, through one of its inquisitors, declared witches a real and present danger, then to act against them was to defend Christendom itself. Imagination was perhaps the most insidious of the three. The Malleus provided lurid, detailed descriptions of witches' supposed activities: pacts with demons, nocturnal flights, Sabbaths with the devil, and powers to kill, maim, or seduce. These images, repeated in courtrooms and sermons, lodged themselves in the European mind. A villager who once thought of his neighbor as a petty troublemaker might now envision her as a nocturnal conspirator in a satanic army. The witch was no longer an isolated figure. She was part of a collective enemy. As the 16th century unfolded, these forces intersected with broader currents of change. The Protestant Reformation shook Europe to its core, fragmenting religious unity and intensifying anxieties. Both Protestant and Catholic regions would conduct witch trials, often citing works like the Malleus as precedent. The wars of religion that swept the continent heightened fear, and in times of uncertainty, accusations multiplied. The manual's vision of a vast conspiracy of witches resonated in an age when conspiracy and treachery were daily fears. The scale of witch hunts in Central Europe during the late 16th and early 17th centuries demonstrates the enduring shadow of the Malleus. In regions like Würzburg, Bamberg, and Trier, entire towns were engulfed by accusations. Hundreds were executed in waves of trials that consumed not only supposed witches, but also clergy, children, and officials. Although the Malleus was not the sole text behind these tragedies, it had set the intellectual stage. It had hardened the association between witchcraft, heresy, and diabolical conspiracy, giving persecutors a coherent language for their actions. In daily life, the consequences were devastating. A midwife accused of causing infant deaths might face questioning under procedures laid out by the Malleus. A farmer whose cattle died suddenly could see his neighbor brought before a court, interrogated with the very logic the manual prescribed. Confessions, wrung under torture, would mirror the text's pages, reinforcing its claims in a cycle that seemed self-proving. The accused often confessed not to what they believed, but to what the judges already expected to hear: tales of Sabbaths, pacts, and demonic flight. The gendered nature of these accusations remained pronounced. By emphasizing women's supposed weakness, the Malleus ensured that women made up the overwhelming majority of victims. Widows without protection, healers with knowledge outside official medicine, and women who spoke too freely became particular targets. Their ordinary roles in childbirth, food preparation, and healing essential for survival were reimagined as avenues for evil. The very tasks that sustained communities became grounds for suspicion. And yet, the influence of the Malleus was not uniform. Some regions resisted its harshness. In England, for instance, while witch trials did occur, the legal system placed more emphasis on evidence than on confession under torture, leading to fewer executions compared to Central Europe. In Spain, the Inquisition remained skeptical of widespread witchcraft charges, preferring to focus on heresy linked to Jews and Muslims. These regional variations remind us that the Malleus was not destiny. Its impact depended on local conditions, authorities, and traditions. By the 17th century, skepticism began to rise more forcefully. The very excesses of witch hunts provoked criticism. Thinkers like Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician, argued that many accused witches were suffering from melancholy or delusion rather than engaging in real witchcraft. Legal scholars began questioning the reliability of confessions obtained under torture. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and natural explanation, would eventually erode the intellectual foundations that the Malleus had laid. Still, the shadow of the book lingered. Long after skepticism grew, its imagery remained. Even today, when one thinks of witches flying at night, gathering in Sabbaths, or casting curses, these images owe as much to the Malleus as to folklore. Its pages did not simply describe a world, they created one, giving shape to fears that might otherwise have remained formless. The Malleus Maleficarum teaches us how words can become weapons. A single book, born of one man's zeal and frustration, helped shape centuries of persecution. It did so not through armies or kings, but through repetition, legitimacy, imitation, forces subtle yet profound, capable of turning suspicion into doctrine, and doctrine into death. And so we are left with a reflection. If a book could wield such influence, what does this reveal about the fragile line between knowledge and fear, between explanation and accusation? How many other moments in history have been shaped not by armies, but by words on a page? And how often do we still carry those words, unexamined, into our present? Asterisk, as the 16th century gave way to the 17th, witch trials no longer belonged only to whispered fears in villages or the weighty words of theologians. They had become industries of accusation, drawing in not only frightened neighbors, but also ambitious men who saw in witch hunting an opportunity for status, income, and influence. From Germany to Scotland, from France to England, the figure of the professional witchfinder emerged. Men whose reputations were built on rooting out witches, men who traveled from town to town, their trade bound up in fear and execution. It is one of the less romanticized aspects of the period that witch hunting, for all its religious fervor and communal panic, was also a livelihood. While many trials remained local and spontaneous, others bore the mark of professional hunters, inquisitors, or experts who lent a chilling efficiency to the process. They operated with the authority of courts or the endorsement of towns, but their work was also deeply personal, a way to turn suspicion into profit. The career of a witchfinder depended on the landscape of Europe in turmoil of the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, devastated the German lands, leaving famine, disease, and dislocation in its wake. In such a climate, suspicion thrived. Soldiers plundered fields, plague emptied villages, and harvests failed, with communities desperate for explanations. Accusations multiplied, and into this desperation stepped men who claimed to have the expertise to unmask witches. One of the most notorious was Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witchfinder general in England during the 1640s. Hopkins was not a priest or a judge, but a layman who, with a mixture of zeal and cunning, fashioned a career from witch hunting. He traveled through East Anglia at a time of civil war, when authority was fractured and fear of disorder ran high. Hopkins offered his services to towns, eager to rid themselves of suspected witches. He and his associates conducted examinations, oversaw interrogations, and sometimes orchestrated trials that led to dozens of executions. His methods were brutal, watching women for sleeplessness, pricking their skin for the devil's mark, and subjecting them to the swimming test, where the accused were bound and thrown into water the innocent would sink. The guilty float. Hopkins's work shows how witch hunting could become a profession. He charged fees for his services, making witch-finding not only a moral crusade, but also a source of income. Towns paid him willingly, believing his skills would protect them from diabolical threats. In this way, fear was commodified. Accusation became a market transaction. The livelihoods of hunters like Hopkins depended on the continuation of trials. The professionalization of witch-finding was not unique to England. In Germany, where the witch hunts reached their deadliest intensity, inquisitors and judges sometimes traveled between towns, carrying their reputations with them. Their arrival could spark waves of accusations as villagers rushed to denounce one another, knowing that the attention of an expert had been drawn to their community. Local authorities, eager to demonstrate their vigilance, welcomed such figures. But each accusation also carried costs. Trials required resources. What is most chilling is how ordinary daily life fed into this trade. Imagine a town already weakened by war, where food was scarce and disease common. In such a place, a traveling witchfinder might arrive with the promise of certainty, Cade claimed. He could name the source of misfortune, expose the secret agents of the devil. For a frightened community, this offered relief. Instead of chaos without cause, there was now explanation, and, with it, action. The townspeople would fund the witchfinder's work, believing that the deaths of a few neighbors might protect the whole. The methods of witchfinders reflected this transactional nature. The devil's mark became a standard test. Examiners searched the body for unusual blemishes, birthmarks, or scars, believing these to be proof of a pact with Satan. The accused were stripped, shaved, and examined with pins or needles. Professional prickers even claimed to know how to identify a mark that would not bleed when pierced. It was a procedure as humiliating as it was unscientific, but it carried the force of expertise in the minds of the community of witchfinders. Authority made the accusation credible. In some regions, witchfinders also profited from confessions extracted under torture. A victim under duress might name others, expanding the circle of accusation. Each new name meant more trials, more work for the inquisitors, and more opportunities for confiscations. The system was self-perpetuating, ensuring that once it began, it rarely stopped until entire communities were consumed. The role of witchfinders reveals the complex intersection of fear, authority, and livelihood. These were not simply fanatics, driven by belief. The belief was certainly part of their work. They were also entrepreneurs of fear, navigating the fragile economies of their time. Hopkins, for example, accumulated enough wealth from his witch-hunting career to live comfortably before his early death. Others, less famous but equally active, carved out reputations as indispensable protectors of their towns. But the presence of professional witchfinders also fueled skepticism. Critics pointed out the financial motives behind their zeal. Some judges grew uneasy with the scale of accusations, suspecting that greed played as much a role as piety. In certain cases, witchfinders themselves were challenged, their credibility undermined by questions of profit. This tension would eventually contribute to the decline of witch hunts, as communities began to question whether fear was being manipulated for gain. Still, for a time, the witchfinders' trade flourished. It turned private suspicion into public spectacle, and it ensured that fear remained not just a feeling, but a system, where the Malleus Maleficarum had provided the theory. Men like Hopkins provided the practice, bringing the hammer of witches down on countless ordinary lives. And so, we must ask, when fear itself becomes a livelihood, how does one measure its true cost, not only in coins and confiscated fields, but in the silence, suspicion, and shattered bonds of communities? The trade of witch-finding, though built upon fear, was sustained by method. It was not random suspicion alone that carried women and men to the stake, but a sequence of procedures, rituals, and tests that witchfinders used to transform rumor into what courts accepted as evidence. These methods, though crude and deeply flawed, became part of a recognizable system, one that lent witch hunts a semblance of order and authority. To understand how this worked, I must picture the setting of a 17th century village, awaiting the visit of a witchfinder. The air of unease often preceded him. Rumors might already be spreading, a cow that had fallen sick, butter that would not churn, an infant who died suddenly in its cradle. These tragedies were common in pre-modern life, but when a witch-finder arrived, they were reinterpreted. What had been misfortune could now be presented as malice. The witch-finder did not create fear out of nothing. He harnessed what was already there and gave it form. One of the most widely used techniques was the search for the devil's mark. The belief was simple. Witches, in forming a pact with Satan, received a mark on their bodies as a sign of their allegiance. It might be a mole, a wart, or even a patch of skin insensitive to pain. Witchfinders and their assistants conducted thorough examinations, often stripping and shaving the accused to ensure no mark was concealed. Professional prickers claimed expertise in identifying such marks. They carried long, thin needles and pierced the skin of suspects, announcing with authority if a spot did not bleed or did not cause pain. In the imagination of the time, such a mark confirmed guilt. The procedure was humiliating and invasive, reducing accused women to objects of inspection before neighbors, officials, and strangers alike. Yet, in communities desperate for certainty, the spectacle of examination carried a strange reassurance. Here was visible proof for what passed as proof that suspicion was justified. The witchfinder's authority lent weight to the conclusion, and once the mark was found, defense became nearly impossible. Another infamous test was the swimming or ducking test. Though not universally practiced, it became closely associated with witchfinders in England and parts of Germany. The logic followed a distorted theology. Water, as a pure element used in baptism, would reject the guilty. Thus, a witch cast into water would float, repelled by its sanctity, while the innocent would sink. Accused individuals were bound and lowered into rivers or ponds, sometimes with ropes to prevent drowning. Communities gathered to watch, turning the ordeal into a public ritual. The sight of a woman struggling in cold water, her body rising or sinking, became a visible drama of guilt or innocence. In reality, the outcome proved nothing. But in the eyes of villagers, it carried symbolic weight. Interrogation, too, was shaped by witchfinders' methods, guided by manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum and local custom. Questions were often framed to elicit confession. Suspects were asked if they had harmed cattle, cursed neighbors, or consorted with spirits. Under pressure, with threats of torture or the agony of sleep deprivation, many confessed. Some named others, whether to lessen their own suffering or because leading questions suggested names to them. These confessions expanded the circle of accusation, drawing new victims into the process. The role of sleep deprivation deserves attention. In some regions, accused witches were kept awake for days, watched constantly to prevent rest. The belief was that witches could only resist confession through the aid of demons, and that exhaustion would break their supernatural protection. In practice, sleeplessness disoriented the accused, leaving them vulnerable to suggestion. Under such conditions, many admitted to acts they had never committed, sometimes even spinning elaborate tales that mirrored what interrogators expected to hear. Another element of the witchfinder's trade was the staging of trials themselves. These were not quiet legal proceedings, but public events. Villagers gathered in churchyards or town halls to hear accusations, watch examinations, and, in some cases, witness executions. The process had a performative quality. Fear was not only enacted, but reinforced before the community. Each trial reminded villagers of the presence of evil in their midst, justifying the witchfinder's role in ensuring that his services remained in demand. Economics, as in all trades, was woven into the process. Witchfinders charged fees for their works, sometimes fixed amounts for examinations, sometimes additional sums for each confession or execution. Towns paid willingly, convinced they were purchasing protection. The costs of trials, from jailers' wages to executioners' fees, were often covered by confiscating the property of the accused. This financial cycle ensured that the machinery of persecution could sustain itself, especially during periods of hardship when fear was sharpest. The social fabric of villages also shaped how witch-finders operated. Accusations rarely emerged in isolation. They grew from long-standing tensions, a quarrel over land boundaries, a dispute at the communal oven, or resentment over unpaid debts could all transform into accusations when a witch-finder arrived. His presence gave these grievances new language. Instead of mere neighborly conflict, they became evidence of maleficium harm caused by witchcraft. Old grudges, once limited to muttered curses, could now end in execution. Children, too, played a role. In several notorious cases, including those Hopkins investigated, children's testimonies carried extraordinary weight. Their claims of seeing spirits, witnessing Sabbaths, or being bewitched were often accepted without question. Witchfinders encouraged these stories, for they reinforced the narrative of widespread evil. In this way, even the young became participants in the machinery of persecution. Their imaginations enlisted to sustain adult fears, but the witchfinder's trade was not without its critics. As accusations multiplied, some communities began to notice troubling patterns. Why did witchfinders always seem to find witches wherever they went? Why did their examinations always yield results, even when suspicion had been thin? Skeptics pointed to financial motives, arguing that witchfinders profited too much from their discoveries to be trusted. Some judges, disturbed by the scale of executions, curtailed witchfinders' authority. On a few cases, witchfinders themselves faced trial when their credibility collapsed. Nevertheless, for decades, the trade endured. It thrived in the spaces where fear, law, and profit overlapped. It functioned because communities believed in its necessity and because its practitioners presented themselves as indispensable experts. To the frightened villager, the witchfinder was not an opportunist, but a savior, capable of uncovering the hidden agents of the devil. And as long as that belief held, the trade remained alive. Yet, the question lingers. What happens to a society when the pursuit of safety becomes a profession, when fear itself becomes a service to be purchased? Does protection ever truly arrive? Where does the trade require that fear continue, feeding itself endlessly? By the mid-17th century, the witchfinder's trade had reached its height and was already beginning to show signs of decline. What had once been a feared and respected profession, sustained by the authority of law and the urgency of communal fear, started to unravel under scrutiny. The very practices that had given witchfinders powered their examinations. Their fees, their relentless uncovering of hidden witches, eventually became their undoing. In England, Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witchfinder general, is a telling example. Between 1644 and 1647, Hopkins and his associates were responsible for more executions than had taken place in the previous century in England. His methods, brutal and theatrical, shocked communities into compliance. Yet, by the end of his short career, suspicion turned upon him. Critics accused him of profiteering, noting that towns paid significant sums for his services. His swimming tests and endless examinations began to look less like justice and more like business. Hopkins died young in 1647, perhaps of tuberculosis, but his trade was already tainted. In the years that followed, English authorities grew cautious, wary of unleashing another professional whose zeal threatened to consume entire regions. On the continent, too, Skepticism grew in German lands where witch hunts had claimed thousands of lives. Some jurists began to question the reliability of confessions extracted under torture. Legal scholars pointed out the circular logic at the heart of trials. Torture produced confessions that matched expectations, which in turn justified further torture. The cycle, once seen as proof of witches' existence, now looked increasingly like a self-perpetuating fraud. As doubt spread, the credibility of professional witch-finders waned. Economic strain also played a role. Witch trials were costly affairs. Jailers, scribes, torturers, and executioners all required payment. Communities that had once funded trials willingly began to notice the burden on their treasuries. Confiscations of property, which had at first offset expenses, dwindled as executions mounted. Villages devastated by war and famine could ill afford the luxury of professional witch-finders. What had seemed a necessary expense in times of panic came to be viewed as unsustainable. The trade also faltered because of its excesses. In places like Würzburg and Bamberg in Germany, entire communities had been torn apart by massive witch hunts in the early 1600s. Children as young as 10, priests, and even city officials had been executed. These hunts, often overseen or fueled by zealous judges and itinerant witch-finders, reached such extremes that they shocked contemporaries. When prominent citizens fell under accusation, doubt could no longer be ignored. If even priests and noblemen could be witches, what did that say about the process itself? Daily life began to reflect this fatigue. Villagers who had once participated eagerly in trials started to grow weary. Fear still lingered, but suspicion of witch-finders themselves crept in. Did they truly protect communities, or did they bring more trouble than they solved? When a witch-finder entered a town, some now greeted him with unease rather than gratitude. His presence threatened not only the accused, but the stability of the whole community. Skeptical voices grew louder in print as well. Physicians like Johann Weyer argued that supposed witches were often the mentally ill, deserving care rather than punishment. Legal scholars published critiques of torture, pointing out its unreliability. Even some clergy began to preach restraint, warning that excessive trials dishonored Christianity by shedding innocent blood. While such voices did not end witch hunts immediately, chipped away at the authority of witch-finders, weakening the foundation on which their trade depended. By the late 17th century, the decline was visible. Large-scale witch hunts ceased after the 1660s, and professional witch-finders no longer traveled openly. In France, the royal courts imposed stricter control, curbing local trials. In Germany and Switzerland, skepticism gradually tempered the once feverish pace of prosecutions. By the dawn of the 18th century, witch-finders had largely disappeared, their trade discredited by the very zeal that had made them famous, and yet their legacy endured. For decades, witch-finders had turned fear into livelihood, reshaping communities through accusation and execution. They had made suspicion a service, one that could be purchased and repeated. Their work demonstrated how systems of persecution can become self-sustaining, feeding not only on belief, but on profit. In this sense, the witch-finder's trade was more than a grim footnote. It was a warning about the dangers of fear when combined with authority and reward. Looking back, one cannot help but wonder about the countless lives lost to this trade. Ordinary women and men, caught in webs of suspicion, stood before witch-finders who had every incentive to find guilt. Their stories fragmented in trial records, preserved in confessions wrung under torture, remind us that the machinery of persecution was not only about belief, it was about livelihoods, about careers built on accusation, and about the fragility of justice when fear and profit walk hand in hand. And so, the story of the witch-finder closes with a troubling reflection. If fear itself can be turned into a profession, how many other trades in history have been built not on truth, but on the perpetuation of suspicion? Asterisk, when European settlers crossed the Atlantic in the 17th century, they carried more than tools, seeds, and faith. They also carried fears. The New World offered vast landscapes, strange climates, and encounters with unfamiliar peoples, but it also transplanted old anxieties across the ocean. Among these anxieties was the belief in witches and inheritance from centuries of European suspicion. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, and the bitter memories of trials that had scarred communities from Germany to Scotland. The Puritans of New England, in particular, were deeply shaped by these fears. Their worldview was stark. Life was a constant battle between God and Satan, with no neutral ground. Every misfortune, whether failed harvest, illness, or infant death, could be interpreted as evidence of the devil's hand. In such a setting, witchcraft became more than a rumor. It was seen as an active threat to the fragile survival of colonial society. The most infamous expression of this fear unfolded in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. Yet to understand Salem, one must step back and see the wider colonial context. New England was a frontier world. Harsh winters, crop failures, outbreaks of smallpox, and a constant threat of conflict with Native American tribes created an environment of relentless insecurity. Puritan communities, tightly knit and guided by strict theology, sought explanations for their hardships. Witchcraft, already familiar from European narratives, provided one. Before Salem, smaller witchcraft cases had already occurred in the colonies. In Connecticut, several women were executed for witchcraft as early as the 1640s. These trials bore the same hallmarks as European cases: accusations arising from misfortunes, confessions extracted under pressure, and suspicions falling most heavily on women living at the margins. The colonies, though far from Europe, were not immune to its patterns. The soil of suspicion was already tilled, by the time Salem's crisis erupted. The community was primed. It began in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, where his daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams began displaying strange fits, screaming, contorting, and claiming to see invisible spirits. A deeply religious community, such behavior was quickly interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. Physicians found no natural cause, and the explanation turned toward the supernatural. When the girls accused several local women, among them Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean origin, Sarah Good, a destitute beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a woman who defied Puritan norms, the machinery of suspicion began to turn. The accusations in Salem spread rapidly. What began with a few afflicted girls grew into a frenzy, as more villagers claimed to see specters, suffer attacks, or witness strange phenomena. Courts accepted spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit had tormented others, even if their body was elsewhere. This lowered the bar for conviction to the point where almost anyone could be accused. Once suspicion took hold, defense was nearly impossible. To deny the existence of witches was to deny scripture, and to deny accusations was to risk being accused oneself. The trials in Salem quickly escalated. Within months, dozens were accused, and the jails filled. Families were torn apart, neighbors turned against one another, and ministers debated how to interpret the chaos. At the height of the panic, 20 people were executed, 19 hanged, and one, Giles Corey, pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Dozens more languished in prison, some dying before their cases could be resolved. Daily life in Salem during the trials must have been saturated with fear. To walk through the village was to see neighbors whispering, families divided, and gallows looming on the horizon. Fields still needed tending, and animals still required care, but the ordinary rhythms of survival were overshadowed by constant suspicion, glance, a word, or a quarrel could become evidence of diabolical activity. In such an atmosphere, silence offered no safety. Suspicion could fall upon anyone, regardless of piety or reputation. The role of children and adolescents in fueling the trials is particularly striking. Their testimonies, full of dramatic fits and vivid descriptions, were accepted as truth. In a society that prized obedience and order, the voices of the young suddenly carried immense weight. This reversal reflected the desperation of the moment when uncertainty reigned. Even the trembling cries of children seemed more reliable than the silence of adults. The colonial context also shaped the panic. The late 17th century was a time of political instability in Massachusetts. The colony's charter had been revoked in 1684, leading 2 years of uncertainty about governance. Wars with Native Americans on the frontier added further stress, with refugees flooding into towns and spreading tales of violence and loss. Against this backdrop, Salem's witch trials were not only about individual accusations, but about a community struggling to make sense of upheaval on all sides. And yet, even at the height of the panic, skepticism persisted. Some ministers urged caution, warning against the dangers of spectral evidence. A few judges hesitated, uneasy with the rapid spread of accusations. Over time, these voices grew stronger. By 1693, the tide turned. The governor of Massachusetts, influenced by criticism and perhaps alarmed by the chaos, intervened to halt the trials. Those imprisoned were gradually released, though their lives remained scarred by the experience. The legacy of Salem is complex. On the one hand, it was a local tragedy, destroying lives in a single community. On the other, it became a symbol of the dangers of fear, suspicion, and unchecked authority. Unlike the vast hunts of Germany or Switzerland, Salem's scale was smaller, but its story, preserved in trial records and cultural memory, became one of the most famous witch hunts in history. And beyond Salem, the New World continued to wrestle with witchcraft fears. In places like Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and even the Caribbean, accusations surfaced sporadically. The details varied, but the underlying pattern was familiar. Misfortune explained by malice, suspicion magnified by courts, and the accused left defenseless. The question that lingers at the end of this first section is this: why did Salem, among all the witch trials of the New World, leave such a lasting mark on history when so many others have faded from memory? Asterisk. The Salem witch trials did not erupt in a single moment of chaos. They unfolded step by step, each decision, each testimony, and each execution feeding the next. To understand the escalation, one must look at how ordinary disputes, long-standing resentments, and fragile political structures converged with religious fervor and fear. When the first accusations began in early 1692, the accused were women who already stood at the margins of Salem society. Sarah Good, destitute and often seen begging, had long been a target of suspicion. Sarah Osborne, who had challenged inheritance customs and defied Puritan norms, was already viewed as disruptive. Tituba, enslaved and of Caribbean origin, stood outside the rigid hierarchies of Puritan identity. Their social vulnerability made them easy scapegoats when the afflicted girls named them as tormentors. The accusations resonated with community prejudice. Tituba's confession, in particular, transformed the trials. Under pressure, she admitted not only to practicing witchcraft, but to seeing other witches in the village, conspiring with the devil. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of a hidden conspiracy. She described animals, shadowy figures, and gatherings at night. These details echoed European witchcraft narratives, even though they were filtered through the imagination of a woman under duress. Her confession validated the fears of magistrates. If witches were real, they were not isolated individuals, but part of a wider, organized threat. This confession became the spark that widened the circle. Suddenly, Salem was not dealing with a few misfits, but with an invisible network of witches embedded within the community. Every unexplained illness, every quarrel, every misfortune could be tied to this imagined conspiracy. The trials expanded rapidly, and soon even respected members of society fell under suspicion. Rebecca Nurse, a well-regarded elderly woman known for her piety, was accused and eventually executed. Her condemnation shocked many, for it revealed that even virtue offered no protection. The acceptance of spectral evidence played a crucial role in sustaining the panic. Courts allowed testimony that a witch's spirit or specter had harmed the afflicted, even if the accused was elsewhere at the time. The afflicted girls, writhing and screaming in the courtroom, claimed to see invisible shapes tormenting them. Judges, influenced by long-standing beliefs about the devil's power, accepted these claims as proof. In effect, the invisible became admissible in law. This blurred the line between belief and evidence, making conviction far easier in defense. Nearly impossible. Daily life in Salem during this escalation must have been suffocating. Families divided against one another, old grudges reignited, and suspicion infiltrated every household. Farmers still planted fields, children still gathered water from wells, and women still baked bread in communal ovens, but all under the shadow of fear. To be seen in the wrong company, to quarrel too loudly, or to mutter at the wrong moment could be enough to draw suspicion. In a society that prized conformity and piety, any deviation risked exposure. Confessions played another key role in the trial's momentum. Those who confessed to witchcraft, whether sincerely or under pressure, were often spared execution. Instead, they were urged to name others. Incentive created a grim cycle. Confessions bred new accusations, which in turn produced more confessions. The result was a web of testimony that ensnared dozens of villagers, regardless of their prior standing. For some, confession offered the only hope of survival. For others, silence meant the gallows. The courts themselves were shaped by the turmoil of the time. The colony of Massachusetts was in political flux. Its charter had been revoked, and the new government was only just re-established under royal authority. Judges and magistrates, eager to demonstrate their commitment to order and piety, approached the trials with severity. They saw themselves not only as arbiters of local disputes, but as defenders of a community under spiritual attack. In their minds, leniency could invite divine wrath. Executions reinforced the terror. On Gallows Hill, the condemned were hanged before crowds of neighbors. The sight of familiar faces, mothers, fathers, respected elders dangling from ropes was both shocking and instructive. It reminded the community that no one was safe, and it warned others not to resist the court's authority. Public punishment, long a part of early modern justice, took on a new intensity when applied to witchcraft. For these executions were framed as victories over the devil himself. The trials reached their peak in the summer of 1692. At one point, more than 150 people were imprisoned, awaiting trial. Families were ruined, farms left untended, and children orphaned. The social fabric of Salem, already fragile, was torn apart. What began in a minister's household had engulfed an entire region, yet cracks in the hysteria soon appeared. It's prominent figures like Increase Mather, a respected minister, warned against the reliance on spectral evidence. It were better, he wrote, that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. His words, though simple, cut against the momentum of the trials. Other ministers echoed his caution, and slowly, doubt crept into the public sphere. By October, Governor William Phips, alarmed by the scale of accusations and influenced by growing criticism, intervened. He dissolved the special court of Oyer and Terminer, which had overseen the trials, and barred the use of spectral evidence. With this shift, the machinery of accusation collapsed. Those still imprisoned were gradually released, though many remained stigmatized and impoverished. The end of the trials left Salem scarred. Families of the executed carried shame for generations. Communities struggled to reconcile with the fact that neighbors had turned on neighbors. The very mechanisms of order courts, ministers, and magistrates had fueled chaos. In the years that followed, Massachusetts publicly acknowledged the injustice. Some victims' families received compensation, though no payment could undo the damage. The escalation and collapse of Salem's trials illustrate a broader truth, that fear, once unleashed, can spread rapidly, but can also exhaust itself when its successes become undeniable. What had seemed unassailable in July unraveled by October. But the question lingers: why did such panic consume Salem so completely? And why there, in that time, when other communities resisted similar outbreaks? When the last of the accused were released and the gallows fell silent, Salem was left with a wound that did not close quickly. The witch trials of 1692 had ended, but their echo lingered in the lives of survivors, in the memory of the community, and in the conscience of a young colony trying to reconcile faith with justice. To understand the legacy of Salem, one must look not only at its immediate aftermath, but also at how its memory shaped the New World's view of law, belief, and fear. In the short term, the effects were devastating. 20 executions, several deaths in prison, and the ruin of many families left the town fractured. Children of the condemned faced stigma for years, carrying the burden of their parents' supposed guilt. Property seized or left untended during imprisonment was lost. The daily rhythm of colonial life, planting, harvesting, building, had been interrupted by months of trials, leaving practical scars alongside emotional ones. The courts that had overseen the panic faced their own reckoning. The dissolution of the Court of Oyer in Terminer was more than an administrative act. It was a public recognition that the process had gone too far. Governor Phipps, seeking to restore order, established a new court that barred the use of spectral evidence, sharply reducing the scope of prosecutions. In the years that followed, juries grew more hesitant, and accusations no longer carried the automatic weight they once had for the Puritan ministers. 2. The trials left a troubling legacy. Men like Cotton Mather, who had defended the proceedings, found their reputations shadowed by the outcome. Others, like Increase Mather, who had urged caution, emerged with greater moral authority. The theological debates of 1692 were not simply about witches, but about the credibility of ministers themselves. Could spiritual leaders be trusted when their guidance had fueled so much bloodshed? In 1697, Massachusetts declared a day of fasting in repentance for the tragedy of Salem. Some judges publicly confessed their error, acknowledging that innocent lives had been taken. Yet repentance did not erase the memory of what had happened. For decades, the names of the accused remained marks of shame, and the community struggled to speak openly of the events. What makes Salem unique is not only the intensity of its panic, but also its lasting place in American memory. Other New World trials occurred: executions in Connecticut, accusations in Pennsylvania, fears in the Caribbean, but none would be remembered as vividly. Salem became a symbol, perhaps because it was so well documented, perhaps because it occurred in a colony destined to play a central role in American history. Salem became shorthand for the dangers of hysteria and injustice. The legacy extended beyond the 17th century. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Enlightenment thought spread and the United States was founded, Salem's trials were invoked as a warning. They reminded Americans of the perils of unchecked authority, the fragility of due process, and the dangers of letting fear dictate justice. In sermons, essays, and later literature, Salem stood as a dark mirror of what happens when reason collapses. Daily life in Salem gradually returned to ordinary rhythms, plowing fields, building homes, attending church, but the memory of suspicion remained. Families remembered who had accused whom. Neighbors carried grudges born of testimony. Silence often filled the spaces where discussion might have been, for to reopen the past was to risk reigniting old conflicts. The social fabric stitched itself back together, but the seams remained visible. Beyond Salem, witchcraft accusations in the New World dwindled. The trials had revealed the destructive potential of hysteria, and communities grew cautious. In other colonies, accusations surfaced occasionally, but they rarely escalated to executions. The memory of Salem acted as a brake on future outbreaks, a grim lesson written into the culture of early America. Yet, the deeper question persists. Why did Salem's memory endure when other witch trials faded? Part of the answer lies in the timing. Salem occurred at the cusp of the Enlightenment, when skepticism about witchcraft was already spreading in Europe. As a result, Salem was remembered less as proof of witches than as proof of error. It became a cautionary tale, preserved in sermons, court records, and eventually in literature and popular culture. Even today, Salem's story resonates. It is invoked not only in history books, but in discussions of justice, fear, and mass hysteria. The word witch hunt has become a metaphor, used to describe situations where accusations outpace evidence, where communities turn upon themselves. In fear, Salem's legacy, then, is not only about the 20 lives lost in 1692, but about the enduring reminder of how quickly fear can consume reason. In reflecting on Salem, one is struck by the ordinariness of the people involved. The afflicted girls, the accused women, the stern magistrates, the frightened villagers. They were not extraordinary figures, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary fear. Their lives, their crops, their disputes were much like those of countless other communities. And yet, in Salem, these ordinary threads wove together into a tapestry of tragedy that still draws our attention centuries later. And so, the story of Salem closes not with resolution, but with a question that lingers in the American conscience. If fear could so swiftly overwhelm a small colonial village, what protects us today from letting fear dictate justice again? Asterisk in the grand narratives of witch trials, tension often falls on the infamous names Matthew Hopkins in England, and Malleus Maleficarum in Europe, the tragic executions at Salem. But behind these headlines of history lay thousands of quieter stories, villagers, farmers, widows, shepherds, and servants whose lives were consumed by accusation. Their names, often scribbled in trial records and then forgotten, revealed the true human cost of the witch hunts. For while courts and theologians debated, it was the ordinary who suffered. To understand the place of the common villager in witch trials, one must picture the texture of life in early modern Europe. Most people lived in small communities, dependent on the land, tied to the rhythm of the seasons. Fields had to be sown, animals tended, bread baked, and wood gathered. Poverty was widespread, and survival precarious. Illness could sweep through households, famine could strike suddenly, and war could pass through fields without warning. In such conditions, suspicion thrived. Misfortune demanded explanation, and when no natural cause seemed sufficient, neighbors turned upon one another. Accusations often began with the simplest of disputes. A cow died after straying into a neighbor's pasture. A child fell ill after a quarrel at the well. Bread failed to rise in an oven shared with another family. These events, ordinary in themselves, carried weight in communities primed by sermons and rumors about witchcraft, to accuse a neighbor of maleficent, causing of harm through magic wise, to give shape to otherwise incomprehensible suffering. One of the most striking aspects of these accusations is how often they targeted those on society's margins. Widows, lacking the protection of husbands, were frequent victims. Their independence, often born of necessity, marked them as different. An old woman living alone on the edge of the village, muttering to herself as she gathered firewood, could easily be transformed into a figure of fear. Her very survival outside traditional family structures became suspect. Poverty, too, carried risk. Those forced to beg for food or firewood sometimes inspired resentment. If a beggar was refused bread, and the household later fell ill, the connection seemed obvious to villagers steeped in the belief that curses had power. A muttered word, a sharp look, a whispered complaint could become evidence when misfortune followed. Powerless, already struggling to survive, bore the brunt of suspicion. Midwives and healers also faced particular danger. Their knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and remedies placed them in roles both vital and feared. When a birth went badly, when a mother or infant died, suspicion fell easily upon the woman who had overseen the delivery. Her skills, which sustained life in countless cases, were reinterpreted as diabolical when death intervened. What had been wisdom in one season became witchcraft in another. Trial records from Germany, Scotland, and France are filled with such stories. A woman accused of spoiling butter, man blamed for storms that ruined crops, girl suspected after a neighbor's pig died. These charges, mundane in detail, reflected the daily anxieties of survival. They remind us that witchcraft was not some abstract concept, but a framework through which ordinary communities tried to explain the unpredictable world around them. The process of accusation often followed a grimly familiar path. It began with rumor, whispered in fields and marketplaces. Then came formal complaint, lodged with local authorities. The accused would be summoned, questioned, and pressed to confess. Torture or sleep deprivation often followed, and under such pressure, even the innocent admitted guilt. Once a confession was secured, names of accomplices were demanded, widening the circle of suspicion. Thus, one misfortune could ripple through an entire community, consuming many lives. The impact on families was immense. Children of the accused faced stigma that could last for generations. Husbands or wives left behind were burdened with debt, their property confiscated or destroyed. Communities fractured as neighbors turned upon one another. Friendships dissolved in suspicion, and the fragile bonds of survival snapped under pressure. And yet, these stories rarely survive in detail. We remember the names of famous witch-finders, but not the widows they condemned. We recall the sermons of theologians, but not the shepherds whose lives were taken. The ordinary villagers, who made up the vast majority of victims, remain in the shadows of history. Their lives, documented only in fragments, remind us that witch hunts were not extraordinary spectacles, but ordinary tragedies, repeated countless times across Europe and the New World. Their ordinariness is precisely what makes them significant. For every notorious trial, there were dozens of small cases where one or two individuals were accused, tried, and executed without fanfare. These forgotten villagers revealed the depth of fear's reach, how it penetrated not only courts and pulpits, but the daily interactions of neighbors. They show us that witchcraft was not an invention imposed from above, but a belief woven into the fabric of ordinary life. And so, when we speak of witch trials, we must not only imagine the gallows and the manuals, but the quiet cottages, the communal wells, and the shared ovens where suspicion began. For it was here, in the routines of ordinary villagers, that witch hunt took root. But what happens when the ordinary becomes extraordinary? When a small accusation spirals into a wave that consumes entire communities, and when the forgotten villagers' lives are swept into a firestorm of persecution. Asterisk, when we look into the court archives of Europe and the New World, we find not grand conspiracies or extraordinary tales, but quiet stories of ordinary people swept into extraordinary fear. These case studies, scattered across centuries, reveal how witchcraft accusations were rooted not in spectacle alone, but in the mundane disputes and anxieties of daily life. Each case, taken by itself, seems trivial. Taken together, they reveal how fragile survival was, okay? And how quickly suspicion could turn into death. Take, for instance, the case of Walpurga Hausmannen, a midwife from Dillingen in Bavaria, executed for witchcraft in 1587. Walpurga had delivered countless babies in her community. Her knowledge of herbs and remedies, essential in a world where professional medical care was rare. But when several infants died in childbirth, suspicion fell on her. Torture. She confessed to killing children, consorting with the devil, and attending Sabbaths. Her confession, wrung from agony, reflected the expectations of her interrogators more than her reality. Yet it was enough to condemn her. Her case is not unique, echoes in countless accusations against midwives across Europe. Women whose skills were celebrated in one season and criminalized in another. Or consider Alison Device, a young woman in Lancashire, England, whose accusation in 1612 triggered the Pendle witch trials. Alison, poor and disabled, was accused of causing harm to a peddler after a quarrel. Her confession, perhaps shaped by her own fears and the expectations of her interrogators, named other members of her family. In a matter of weeks, 10 people were tried and executed. The Pendle case shows how a single accusation rooted in poverty, disability, and marginalization could spiral into a communal tragedy. In France, records from Lorraine in the 1620s tell of villagers accused after a storm destroyed crops. One woman, already mistrusted for her sharp tongue and solitary habits, was denounced as the cause of the storm. Under questioning, she admitted to summoning hail at the devil's command. Her execution reassured her neighbors that order had been restored, even as the true cause of the storm remained the natural unpredictability of weather. The New World offers similar examples. In Connecticut, in 1647, Alice Young became the first person executed for witchcraft in the American colonies. Little is known of her case, but records suggest she was accused during a time of epidemic and economic strain. Her name survives only as a brief entry in the records of Hartford. Yet her death reminds us that the fear of witches crossed oceans and reshaped lives in the colonies, just as it had in Europe. Each of these stories points to recurring patterns. The accused were often those who lived at the margins, widows, healers, beggars, or those with physical differences. Their vulnerability made them easy targets. Communities, desperate for explanations of misfortune, found in these individuals both a cause and a solution. To accuse a widow of cursing cattle was to make sense of sudden loss. To execute her was to restore the fragile balance of survival. The details of daily life often played a decisive role. Shared wells, communal ovens, and fields tilled side by side created endless opportunities for conflict. If bread failed in an oven after a quarrel, suspicion followed. If a child drowned in a pond where another villager had been seen muttering, blame was cast. These small, ordinary events, magnified by fear, came trials that ended lives. The confessions extracted under torture revealed the tragedy most clearly. Again and again, villagers admitted to impossible acts flying through the night, summoning into animals, summoning storms. These confessions, absurd to modern eyes, were the product of exhaustion, agony, and the desperate hope that agreeing with interrogators might end the pain. The very words of the accused became weapons against them, preserved in trial records as proof of guilt. Yet, behind the confessions lay real people. Walpurga was a midwife who had helped countless mothers. Allison was a poor girl caught in a quarrel. Alice Young was a colonial settler facing the same hardships as her neighbors. Their ordinariness makes their stories all the more haunting. They were not famous, not powerful, not extraordinary, yet they were caught in the machinery of suspicion and destroyed by it. Communities, too, bore scars. The execution of neighbors did not erase misfortune. Cows still died. Storms still came. Children still fell ill. But now the village carried the added burden of guilt, suspicion, and grief. Families of the accused were left impoverished, their names stained. Neighbors who had testified carried the weight of their words. The bonds of trust, essential in small communities, were broken. In reading these cases, one is struck by how ordinary grievances could become extraordinary accusations. Poverty, illness, jealousy, inheritance, disputes, these were the true fuel of witch hunts. The devil's hand was invoked, but the spark was often a quarrel over bread, land, or reputation. Witchcraft trials, at their heart, were not only about theology, but about the fragile balance of daily life. And so, the forgotten villagers remind us of the true nature of witch hunts. They were not grand conspiracies plotted in dark forests, but small tragedies repeated countless times across Europe and the New World. Their ordinariness is what makes them unforgettable, for it shows how easily fear can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. But what happens when these small tragedies gather momentum? When dozens or even hundreds of villagers are accused together, and the machinery of suspicion consumes entire regions. Asterisk, if individual accusations revealed the fragility of daily life, then mass outbreaks of witchcraft trials revealed how entire communities could unravel when suspicion multiplied. The stories of forgotten villagers, those whose names survive only in fragments, show how ordinary lives could be swept together in a tide of fear that consumed towns, villages, and even whole regions. The German lands provide some of the most devastating examples. In the Prince-Bishopric of Würzburg, during the Erling-S wave of accusations engulfed the city and surrounding villages. It began with a few isolated cases, but soon spiraled, driven by war, famine, and the authority of zealous officials. Records suggest that hundreds of people were executed in just a few years, including nobles, priests, and children. Ordinary villagers made up the majority. Families were torn apart as one confession named another, and suspicion spread from house to house. Among the condemned were children as young as 9, accused of being witches simply because their parents had been executed. For these villagers, daily life became a nightmare of accusation, interrogation, and execution. The community of Bamberg, too, experienced a similar tragedy. In the early 17th century, under the rule of Prince Bishop Johann Georg Fuchs von Dornheim, witch hunts reached a terrifying intensity. Villagers accused of spoiling crops, causing frost, or bringing storms were dragged into courts and tortured until they confessed. Once accused, their fate was almost certain. Confiscated property enriched the authorities, while the villagers themselves were reduced to ashes at the stake. The scale of the Bamberg trials was so immense that entire neighborhoods seemed emptied, with dozens executed within months. The forgotten villagers of Bamberg remind us how quickly suspicion could consume not just individuals, but entire communities. These mass hunts revealed the mechanics of fear. In small villages, people depended on one another for survival sharing, ovens, lending tools, and working side by side in fields. Yet these same ties created fault lines when suspicion spread. A quarrel at the well could be magnified into evidence of witchcraft. A failed harvest could be blamed on the neighbors, supposed pact with the devil. Once authorities became involved, these suspicions were formalized, and villagers were transformed from neighbors into enemies. Scotland offers further examples. In 1661, during what is known as the Great Scottish Witch Hunt, more than 600 people were accused in a single year. Most were ordinary villagers, many women living on the margins. Conversations often began with small misfortunes, cattle deaths, infant illnesses, sudden storms, but quickly spiraled into mass hysteria. Torture and sleep deprivation yielded confessions that confirmed the fears of interrogators, and one name led to another in a widening circle of suspicion. Communities that had once survived together now tore themselves apart, as villagers denounced friends, neighbors, and even kin. One striking feature of these outbreaks is how ordinary villagers' own words, spoken under duress, fed the machinery of persecution. Confessions often included fantastical elements: flight through the night, feasts with the devil, transformations into animals. To modernize these details seem impossible, but in the pressured context of interrogation, they provided the narrative authorities expected. Each confession confirmed the framework of witchcraft, and each name added fuel to the fire. Thus, the words of ordinary villagers wrung from them in agony came the very justification for their deaths. The economic consequences for these communities were immense. When villagers were executed, their property was often confiscated. Fields lay untended, homes abandoned, and children orphaned. The very survival of the community was threatened, not by witches, but by the destruction of its members. Fear consumed not only lives, but also livelihoods. And yet, even in the midst of mass hysteria, some resisted. Courts tell of villagers who spoke out in defense of neighbors, insisting on their innocence despite the risk. Others refused to testify or quietly offered support to the families of the accused. These acts of defiance, though often overshadowed by the louder voice of accusation, remind us that skepticism never vanished entirely. Even in the darkest times, some villagers recognized the injustice, though their voices were too few to halt. The machinery of fear, the forgotten villagers of these mass hunts, remind us that witch trials were not about extraordinary figures, but about ordinary people whose lives were destroyed by suspicion. They were shepherds, bakers, mothers, fathers, children, people whose only crime was misfortune, poverty, or difference. Their ordinariness makes the scale of the tragedy all the more haunting. As the witch hunts subsided in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, communities were left to reckon with the aftermath. Fields had to be replanted, families rebuilt, trust slowly restored, but the scars remained. Villages remembered who had accused whom. Families carried the shame of executed relatives. Communities lived with the knowledge that they had destroyed their own. And so, the story of the forgotten villagers ends not with resolution, but with silence. Their names, recorded in fading ink, remind us that history is not only shaped by rulers, theologians, or witch-finders, but by ordinary lives caught in extraordinary fear. The question that lingers is this: if suspicion could so easily transform daily life into death, what protects us from repeating such patterns when fear turns neighbor against neighbor, and the ordinary, once again, becomes the accused? The history of witch trials cannot be told without the church. For centuries, the church was the central institution of European life, guiding faith, law, and culture. It shaped how people saw the world, explained misfortune, and defined the boundaries of good and evil. The church gave legitimacy to the idea of witches, transformed suspicion into doctrine, and provided the courts sermons, cant, and rituals that sustained persecutions. Yet, its role was not simple. It was marked by contradictions, by debates between skeptics and zealots, and by the tension between pastoral care and institutional power. To see how the church's authority shaped witch trials, we must return to the early Middle Ages. At first, church councils were skeptical of popular beliefs about witches. The Canon Episcopi, a text from the 10th century, declared that women who claimed to ride at night with the goddess Diana were deluded. Their visions, tricks of the devil, rather than real events. For centuries, church authorities emphasized that witches had no real power, that belief in their flights and spells was superstition. This early skepticism suggests that the church initially resisted the very ideas that would later fuel mass hunts. But over time, theology shifted. The growing influence of scholasticism in the 13th and 14th centuries encouraged systematic thinking about the devil, demons, and human pacts with evil. As the Inquisition expanded to root out heresy, witchcraft came to be understood as a form of heresy itself. What had once been dismissed as delusion was reinterpreted as real and dangerous. By the 15th century, church courts and theologians increasingly describe witches not merely as superstitious, but as conscious agents of the devil. United in opposition to God and Christendom, the papacy played a crucial role in this transformation. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, endorsing the work of inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. Malleus Maleficarum would soon systematize witch-hunting practices. The bull gave official support to the idea that witches were real and must be prosecuted, though it was not the sole driver of persecution. It lent papal legitimacy to those eager to act against witches. Sermons amplified these ideas. In village churches, priests warned congregations of the devil's cunning, urging them to remain vigilant against neighbors who might serve his will. Parishioners heard that misfortune was not random, but the work of human agents allied with Satan. The pulpit became a place where fear was cultivated and directed, priming communities to interpret illness, storms, or crop failures as signs of witchcraft. Confession, too, played a role. Parish priests, charged with hearing the sins of their flock, sometimes drew out admissions of charms or folk practices. What might once have been dismissed as harmless could now be framed as dangerous. A whispered charm over a sick child, blessing of cattle before spring practices rooted in tradition, could be redefined as evidence of heretical witchcraft. The church's monopoly on spiritual authority meant that older folk customs, once tolerated, became increasingly suspect. Yet, the church's role was not monolithic. Within its ranks were skeptics who resisted the zeal of witch hunters. Some bishops and theologians argued that confessions under torture were unreliable. Others maintained that witches' powers were illusions, exaggerations of fearful minds, rather than real threats. The tension between belief and doubt ran throughout the church's history. Even as some clergy preached fiery sermons about witches, others urged restraint, warning that too much credence given to superstition dishonored Christian faith. The contradictions are clear when we examine the Inquisition itself. While often associated with harshness, in some regions the Inquisition was more cautious than local courts. In Spain, inquisitors generally treated witchcraft cases with skepticism, preferring to focus on heresy among Jews and Muslims. They dismissed many accusations as delusion or error. In contrast, local secular courts, lacking the same centralized discipline, were often more eager to pursue trials. This unevenness shows that the church was both restraining and encouraging, both skeptical and credulous, depending on time, place, and leadership. Still, the overall effect of the church's authority was to sustain belief in witches. Its theology gave intellectual foundation to fears. Its courts provided structures for prosecution. Its sermons amplified suspicion. In its symbols, the crucifix, the Bible. The authority of the priests were mobilized in the courtroom to confront accused witches. The daily life of parishioners reflected this influence. Those who heard weekly sermons warning of the devil came to see misfortune through a spiritual lens. A hailstorm could be read as punishment, a sudden illness as a curse. To seek justice, they turned not only to secular leaders, but to priests, whose guidance often pointed toward witchcraft. Thus, the church's influence extended deep into the fabric of daily survival, shaping how ordinary people interpreted their world. Asterisk. The church also framed witchcraft as a cosmic battle. Witches were not just neighbors who muttered curses. They were soldiers in the devil's army, enemies of God himself. This gave trials a sense of holy urgency. To prosecute a witch was not only to punish a criminal, but to defend Christendom. It was spiritual warfare carried out in village courts and marketplaces. Yet, even as the church urged vigilance, it carried the burden of doubt. For every priest who thundered against witches, another reminded his flock of Christ's mercy. For every theologian who elaborated the power of demons, another urged caution against overestimating their influence. These contradictions complicate the story, reminding us that the church was never a single voice, but a chorus of competing perspectives. The role of the church in witch trials, then, was one of both power and paradox. It gave fear legitimacy, but sometimes sought to restrain it. It condemned superstition, yet fueled it with sermons. It shaped the very framework through which villagers understood their world. Yet it could not control how far suspicion spread once unleashed. And so, the question lingers. If the church was meant to be a source of guidance and protection, why did its authority so often turn into a weapon against the very flock it was meant to shepherd? Asterisk. If theology shaped the framework of witch trials, it was the daily workings of the church's sermons, rituals, and courts that carried these ideas into the lives of villagers. To understand how deeply the church influenced the witch hunts, one must look at how faith and fear became inseparably woven into the fabric of community life. Every week, villagers gathered in wooden pews, their eyes fixed on the pulpit. Sermons were not abstract discourses. They were moral lessons tied to immediate concerns: illness, famine, storms, or conflict. Ministers spoke in vivid language of the devil's schemes, of the ever-present danger of corruption, and of the responsibility of the faithful to resist. In times of hardship, these words carried enormous weight. The priest's voice was not simply one opinion among many. It was the voice of God's representative. Through these sermons, its craft was framed not as isolated mischief, but as part of a cosmic battle. A failed harvest could be cast as evidence of Satan's war against Christendom. A child's fever could be seen not only as illness, but as the devil's attempt to claim another soul. Witches were described as traitors, betrayers, not just of neighbors, but of God himself. In this way, ordinary misfortunes were elevated into spiritual crises, demanding action. Confession, too, played its part. Parishioners were expected to confess their sins, but priests sometimes heard more than they expected. A villager might admit to whispering a charm over a sick child, or to muttering a prayer not sanctioned by the church. What might once have been dismissed as superstition could now be interpreted as heresy. The church's role as confessor made it both healer of souls and collector of suspicion. What was whispered in private could become evidence in court. Ecclesiastical courts gave these suspicions formal shape. In many parts of Europe, church courts worked alongside or in cooperation with secular courts. Priests reported rumors, bishops authorized investigations, and inquisitors conducted trials. These trials often blurred the line between spiritual discipline and criminal prosecution. A woman who used herbs to heal might find herself charged not only with superstition, but with heresy. A man accused of cursing cattle might be summoned not before his neighbors, but before an inquisitor, armed with theological texts. The church also supplied the rituals that shaped the atmosphere of trials. Exorcisms, blessings, and prayers were part of the process. Accused witches were confronted with crucifixes, compelled to recite the Lord's Prayer, or sprinkled with holy water. Failure to respond correctly could be interpreted as evidence of guilt. These rituals lent trials a spiritual gravity. They were not merely legal proceedings, but battles for souls. The accused stood not only before judges, but before God. Daily life reflected this intertwining of faith and fear. Villagers carried rosaries, hung crosses above doorways, and sprinkled salt to ward off evil. These acts, encouraged by the church, were meant to protect. Yet they also reinforced the sense that danger was ever present, that the devil lurked in barns, fields, and hearths. Fear was sustained not only by rumor, but by ritual. To live in a 16th or 17th century village was to live in a world where spiritual threat was constant, and where the church offered